So how's your memory? How's your memory? How you doing at remembering things? A mom walked into the kitchen one day and she noticed little Tommy, her 6-year-old boy, up on a chair digging into the cookie jar. She said, "Thomas R. Callahan III, what did I tell you would happen the next time I caught you digging in that cookie jar?" Tommy just kind of sat there, shrugged his shoulders, and he said, "Mom, I don't know, but I think it's really strange that you forgot too." Whether we're digging in the cookie jar or whether we're on the internet or on our phones or listening to the radio or watching TV, there is lots of information coming our way. We are in an information overload. There's so much coming at us, but how much of it do we remember? How much are we remembering of all the things that are coming our way? And do we remember the things that are most important? There's lots of distractions today, but can we remember the things that are most important? Are we remembering the things that matter the most? Look, there's no way we can remember everything that's coming our way. We just can't, and we're not supposed to, by the way. But there are some things that we desperately need to remember to help in life. The types of things that can help us when it feels like life is falling apart or coming off the rails. The types of things that we really, really, really need. What kinds of things are we talking about? Well, let's see if we can find out. We're turning our attention in the Bible today to 2 Peter, Peter's second letter. And Peter is someone in both of his letters writing to Christians who were suffering, Christians who were being persecuted, Christians who were dealing with a lot of hard things in life. And he was really big on helping them remember. And he's going to help us remember some things today as well. Our sermon today is called The Ultimate March. And we're going to be looking at 2 Peter, and listen to what he says, chapter 1, verse 12. "Therefore, I will always be ready to remind you of these things." Well, what are these things that he is ready to remind us of? Well, a few sentences back, beginning in verse 5 and through 7, Peter gives us 7 super important things, qualities, if you will, that we need to remember about life. These are things we need to tattoo on our brain when it comes to helping us, honoring God, and also helping others. So let's just fly over them real quick for a moment and look at each one. The first one that he mentions is moral excellence. Back in verse 5, moral excellence. Now, this does not mean that you have to be sinless and perfect. That's not what moral excellence means. It just means that when it comes to the ethical behavior of right and wrong, if we're going to be professing Christians, then we look at least a little bit like the truth that we find in the Bible, a lot more than we look and sound and act like the politics of talk radio or the videos that we see on TikTok. In other words, the truth of who God is, what he has created in us in creation, this innate sense of right and wrong, it's there. Now, someone may say, "Oh, well, being moral, well, that's subjective." You know, your morality may not be my morality. My definition of morals and your definition of morals, well, they may not be the same. So really, it's just subjective. Everybody can choose their own morals. That sounds enlightened. It sounds discerning. It just doesn't work. Not in real life, at least. C.S. Lewis said this: "If no set of moral ideas were truer or better than any other, there would be no sense in preferring civilized morality to savage morality, or Christian morality to Nazi morality." In other words, all definitions of morality are not the same. All definitions of morality are not morality. So when it comes to moral excellence, there is a standard that God has created in creation. And he has detailed that standard, not just in creation, but he has detailed it in his word. So how are you doing with moral excellence? How are you doing when it comes to this excellence of morality that impacts the world around you? Do you do whatever you want, however you want, whenever you want? Or is there some sense in you that drives you toward a type of morality that honors God and helps others? Peter says, look, let me remind you, as you're suffering, as you're frustrated, as you're worried, as you're afraid of all the emotions that you're going through, let me remind you to pursue moral excellence. It will be helpful for your life and helpful for the world around you. Second, he says knowledge. Now, that doesn't mean spend a lot more time on Wikipedia. We can do that. You can rabbit trail with the best of them. Most of us have figured out how to do that, but that's not what he's talking about. He means that we need, as professing Christians, we need to be discovering the character of God. Like who God actually is, how he thinks, how he works, the nature of his love and his grace and his mercy. And by God's design, the way we find out about his character is through the Bible. Yes, we see God in all of creation, but by his design, he's very detailed with his character in the pages of the Bible. So how are you doing at increasing in your knowledge of God and your knowledge of his character and your knowledge of his ways? If we're honest, sometimes our knowledge of God is just kind of what we want to think about him, or what we wish or hope he was like, or sometimes just maybe what we heard our parents or grandparents or great-grandparents or maybe just our favorite TV preacher say. But the reality is God in his kindness has given us the Bible so that we individually would pursue and understand and know who he is, not just know something about him, but to really know him. And so Peter says if you're looking for a quality in life that you really need, that will be helpful to you and helpful to others, you need some knowledge. And he says, let me remind you, pursue the knowledge of God. Third is self-control. Now, self-control does not mean that every now and then you're going to slip and have that 14th piece of bacon, okay? That's going to happen every now and then, all right? It's okay. You'll be all right. Self-control means that Christians should live in such a way that their greatest pleasure and greatest treasure is being saved. That their salvation in Jesus Christ is their ultimate treasure, not just the pleasures of this world. We should show with greater consistency that we are controlled by a love for Jesus, not just a love for the things and the people and the places of this world. So how are you doing with self-control? When you look back over just this past week, has there been a sense that you've been more controlled by the love of Jesus, or have you been a little more controlled by the love of money or power or work or school or golf or hunting or fishing or shopping or Instagramming or whatever it may be? What is it in our life that seems to have so much control over us? Are we being controlled and compelled by the salvation of Jesus that has come to us, or are we being controlled and compelled by a gazillion other things? Peter says, look, let me remind you to be self-controlled. Be controlled by the love of Christ and the salvation of Christ. Fourth, he says, perseverance. Look, life is hard. It's tough. People are difficult and people are crazy. And sometimes the crazy, difficult people is us, right? And sometimes we're the crazy, difficult people. It's just a reality. But part of what it means to be a Christian, part of what it means to follow after Jesus, is that when the crazy things begin to happen, when the tough things begin to happen, when the hard, difficult things begin to happen, we don't check out. We keep following. It doesn't mean that we don't struggle. It doesn't mean that it's not hard, but we keep following. We keep saying, my hope and my treasure is in Jesus. We don't switch up and say, well, I'm going to shift to something else. No, we strive to cling to Jesus more. Now, is that easy to do? No, it's not. It's extremely hard to do. But that doesn't mean that the hope and salvation that we have in Jesus are fake and phony just because it's hard. I was reading this week about Daryl Carmen. He died 2 years ago from cancer. 6 months before he died, his wife died from COVID. When his wife died, and about 6 weeks before he died, he made almost the same exact statement. And this is what he said: God is good, He's been good to me, and I'm ready to go meet Him. That's a heart that knows how to persevere with the salvation of Jesus. That's a heart that says, hey, when things are great, I'm good with Jesus. When things are terrible, I'm good with Jesus. It's a heart that knows how to persevere with the goodness of God, because it's a heart that understands that life isn't just about beating things in life. Life is about the promise of beating death forever. Daryl's pastor, Justin, wrote this: the single best argument that cancer beat Daryl is that his body was taken up on a hill in his hometown of Hartsville, Tennessee, and buried in the ground. Cancer did take his body, and that's worth weeping over. Yet I would point out that Germany and Japan won a lot of battles during World War II, real victories, but in the end, they lost. The same is true with cancer. The most that can be said for cancer is that it has won a battle. But the outcome of the war has been decided. This is what it means to be in Christ. Justin writes, D-Day has already been waged and won. That's what it means to be saved. It means that in the worst moment of our life here on this earth, we've already won. This isn't a fairy tale. The cross outside of Jerusalem is real. The empty tomb is real. We didn't make these things up. There aren't 2,000 years of idiots buying into religion. Jesus was born. Jesus lived. Jesus died a brutal crucifixion. Jesus was raised completely alive again from the dead. He ascended into heaven. He has promised to return, and He has done nothing but prove that He keeps His promises. So we have every reason to believe in the victory, regardless of what battle we lose. Justin goes on to say this: faith sees the big picture. And even now, as we wait for the final victory, we can say by faith that Daryl Carmen beat cancer. See, that doesn't make sense to our human mind. No, cancer beat him. That's why he died. No, because of Christ, it is impossible not for Daryl to beat cancer. There was no way that was not going to happen. And the same is true for us, whatever it is that we face. I know this in our culture today, it sounds very Disney, right? Oh, well, we don't have to worry about our problems in life because Jesus saved us. Yes. Yes. It's not a Disney movie. It's the reality, it's the hope, it's the treasure that we have. Peter said, you know what? Persevere in that. So how are you doing with perseverance? How are you doing with clinging to Christ in all the battles, knowing that the victory has been won? Peter says, look, let me remind you to persevere. Fifth, he says godliness. We could also maybe say holiness there. Now, let's just go ahead and say, unless there's something I don't know about you, none of us are perfect, okay? We're not perfect. We're never going to be perfectly holy. We're never going to be perfectly godly. But if we're going to profess to be Christians, at the very least, we should be pursuing some notion of being like God. I mean, that sounds impossible at first glance, though, right? How in the world are we going to be like God? So what do? Well, let me give you a different angle on this, because I think when we hear godliness and holiness, we think of Mother Teresa and Billy Graham and the Pope, and, I can't be that. Let me see if I can just break it down in a completely different way for us to think about a little bit. Scott Hubbard describes it this way. A single man may dream of sacrificing himself for his wife and his children one day, and yet right now he fails to do his chores. An aspiring missionary may pray to one day plant a church among the unreached people, and yet today she neglects her present small group at church. A postgrad may aspire to one day start a nonprofit, and yet today they cut corners in his job as a cashier. A young Christian may long to remain steadfast under future trials, and yet they grumble at their roommate's dirty dishes. Scott goes on, the wise know that a Christian becomes holy much like a cathedral becomes tall, one stone at a time. And stones are offensively ordinary things. Godliness and holiness is taking the truths of the Bible and making them part of your daily life. Not just an hour or so on Sunday, not just Christmas and Easter, not just any other religious holiday, but godliness is not just about godly activities at church. It's about ordinary godly attitudes toward your spouse and toward your parents and toward your kids and toward people that you work with and go to school with, toward complete strangers. It's about ordinary things. The cathedral is built with the ordinary. So when Peter says, hey, you also need to pursue godliness. Don't go looking for the Pope mobile, okay? But begin to think in your own heart and your own mind, wait a minute, godliness for me today is, these are the truths I know about God. This is what I read in the Bible this morning. This is what I heard in the song that we sang. This is what I heard in the prayer in the sermon. Okay, I'm going to go do something with that. It's the daily, ordinary task of following God that help us pursue godliness. How are you doing with godliness? Peter says, hey, let me remind you to be godly. Let that be a pursuit. Number 6, he says brotherly kindness. This would be mutual affection, so to speak, for Christians. I mean, when we're looking at the concept of godliness, the most basic thing that you could do as a godly person is to show genuine love and concern and kindness for others and to others, especially toward other Christians. You may have seen the t-shirt that says, kindness is free, sprinkle it everywhere. It's true. But Christian kindness is more than a sprinkle. David Mathis says this, Christian kindness is no common courtesy or virtue in a vacuum, but a surprising response to mistreatment and hurt. See, that's different. The kindness that we hear that we're supposed to sprinkle everywhere, it's not that it's bad, but it's different than Christian kindness. Because Christian kindness, by definition, is a response to being mistreated, to not getting what we want or what we think we should have or what we need. David goes on to say this, it is not random or free, but a costly, counterintuitive response to meanness and to outrage rather than responding in kind. I don't know about you, there's a little bit of meanness and outrage in the world today, right? And I know this is when we live, but guess what? It's always been there. There was a lot of meanness and outrage outside the ark. There was meanness and outrage toward Moses and King David and Joshua and so many of the kings. There was meanness and outrage toward the prophets of God. Guess what? There was a lot of meanness and outrage toward Jesus. So this is nothing new. It's just we live now, so we're convinced it's worse than it's ever been. It's not. It's just really bad now. And it's always been really bad. But as a Christian, we have this amazing thing. It's called kindness. It's a response to outrage. It's a response to meanness. Instead of yelling back, we respond differently. I don't ever talk about politics, so I'm gonna keep this kind of benign here, but I was fascinated to see local politicians screaming at each other on the news this week, And I thought, it's a culture that we live in. But before I make any accusations against local politicians, guess where I've seen that also? The church. Yeah, you know what? Ours just didn't show up on the news. It just showed up in the sanctuary. See, we're all capable of that. It's strange and odd that those who have been redeemed and rescued from hell feel completely comfortable responding to outrage with outrage. And we all do it, even in our minds sometimes. But Peter says, pursue brotherly kindness. Pursue a kindness that is Christians. It's not free, it's costly. And you know why it's costly? Because it's valuable. It's extremely valuable. The kindness that the gospel calls us to is costly because it's valuable. And the reason I know that is because the kindness of God found me. My mom sent me the sweetest text a little while ago before church started. Today is my birthday. I know, it's strange. I don't believe I'm 35 either. But my mom sent me a text. I've never heard this before. And she said, my mother always prayed that there'd be a pastor in the family, and she would love if she could hear you today. That's just precious. See, the kindness of God found me. That's why I'm standing here today. I'm not standing here today because I couldn't find anything better to do. I could go do something else. As I told y'all last week, I wanted to be a pharmacist or a lawyer or a model or, I don't know, about 100 other things, I can find something else to do. But see, the kindness of God rescued me, and that's why I'm here. That kindness is extremely valuable because it rescued me from hell. So if we've been rescued from sin and death and hell, you would think we might be able to muster a little kindness toward the outrage and the meanness in the world. Has the kindness of God found you? Have you been rescued by the kindness of God? If so, what does that kindness look like from you in the world around you? Peter said, look, let me remind you, show brotherly kindness. Show an affection that confuses the world. Respond to outrage with kindness. And let me just say, of course, that doesn't mean if someone breaks into your house, I'm just going to be kind to you, buddy. Take what you want. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about when outrage and meanness comes our way. Let us show that the gospel has captured our heart and how we respond with kindness. And then seventh, Peter says love. Now, this ain't Hallmark movie channel love, all right? There's a different kind of love here. The word Peter uses for love here describes a God-like love that even is able to love enemies. A God-like love that's even able to love enemies. That's a love that's not convenient, it's not comfortable, it's not coercion, it's choice. This type of love is a choice. It means you are going to choose to love. Now, someone may say, I don't think I like that kind of love. I don't know, maybe that is God's kind of love, but I don't like that kind of love. I don't want to have to love my enemies. I don't want love like that. C.S. Lewis has a very interesting description of love. He says that love is not a safe investment. It's not a safe investment. He said if you're going to love somebody, you're automatically going to be vulnerable. And then he goes on. Love anything and your heart will certainly be wrung and possibly be broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give your heart to no one, not even to an animal. Wrap it carefully around with hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up safe in the casket or coffin of your selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, your heart and love will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable. The alternative to tragedy, or at least to the risk of tragedy, is damnation. And then he says this, the only place outside heaven where you can be perfectly safe from all the dangers and perturbations of love is hell. If you want to be safe from all the dangers and anxieties that come with showing love and giving love, you will have to be in hell. Because that's the only place that love will be safe. The danger, the anxiety, the difficulties, they'll all be there. And Peter says, yep, you need to pursue that. So how are you doing with love? How are you doing with this picture of love? And Peter says, look, let me remind you, look at the love of God. The love of God that shows kindness to people who hate him. The love of God that shows kindness to people who are rebellious against him. And you take that kind of love and you use it in your life. Peter says, look, be ready and pursue love. And those are the qualities he lays out. He says, look, I'm ready to remind you of all these qualities. These things are so important. Can't wait to tell you about them again. And then he says this in verse 12. Even though you already know them and have been established in the truth which is present with you. We know this, right? To be reminded of something means that you already know about it, right? I mean, how many times do parents repeat things to their kids over and over again? Well, it's because they want them to get them. You know, they've already heard it before. You're going to hear it again. Super Bowl 41 was held in what is now known as Hard Rock Stadium in Miami Gardens, Florida. Peyton Manning was the longtime quarterback of the Indianapolis Colts, and during the week of practice leading up to the Super Bowl, he had his center, Jeff Saturday, spend an extra 15 minutes every day snapping footballs to him. Now, the reason that's crazy is because at this point, they had been together for 10 years on the same team, maybe even a little longer. So just general math shows that probably 60,000 times between practice and games, Jeff Saturday had snapped the ball to Peyton Manning. He kind of knew what he was doing. He knew what was going on. And yet, Peyton Manning made him for 15 minutes extra all week long. For an extra hour and a half of his life that week, he had to snap balls to him again with one difference. Those footballs had been soaked in buckets of water. Now, why did he do that? Well, the forecast for Super Bowl Sunday was rain. And you know what happened on Super Bowl Sunday? It rained. It poured. Sports writer Rick Riley said this. He said the opposing quarterback that day looked like he was throwing greased watermelons, and he said that Manning looked like he was throwing rocks. The Colts won that Super Bowl. Why? Well, partly because two guys who already knew what they were doing practiced some more. They reminded themselves again in a different way. Hey, this is important. This is something we need to do. Look, we all have tons of information in our minds. We remember lots of things. I guarantee you, every single one of us in this room and watching, we all have some kind of hobby, something that we like, something that we love. You know, you may know every second baseman that's ever played for the New York Yankees, you know, or you may be able to remember every single recipe that you have ever heard talked about in one way, shape, or another. We know things, right? We remember things. We remember things like sports statistics, and we remember movie quotes, and we remember song lyrics. We remember calorie counts. We remember what we wore to get coffee 7 months ago on a Tuesday afternoon, you know. We remember that Dr. Seuss invented the word nerd. Yeah, that's true, by the way. Well, we know stuff, you know. And it's not that any of the stuff is bad, but is it the most important? See, we remember lots of things that are truly trivial pursuits. But what Peter is saying, look, always be ready to remember something that's not trivial. Be ready to remember something that is a treasure that never fails, a treasure that never goes away, a treasure that lasts forever. And where do we find those treasures? Well, the Apostle Paul put it this way in 2 Timothy 3:16. He said, all Scripture is inspired by God. Part of the reason that we desperately need to fill our minds with the truth of God is because the Bible is full of truth that was breathed out by God. God could have used a lot of different ways to help us see who He is, but it was His design, it was His plan that He would breathe the truth about Himself, His character, His nature in His book. So Peter or Paul or King David or Moses, any of the prophets, the last 2,000 years of all kinds of famous and ordinary everyday Christians, or even Jesus Himself, in some way, shape, or form, have all given us this challenge. Hey, let me remind you, be sure that you put the truth of God in your heart. Become a person of God's book. It is what we need the most. When he was 20 years old, Joseph Guyton from Everett, Michigan, married his sweetheart, Agnes Winona Baker. A couple years later, they had a little girl, Olive Clara. 8 years after they were married, America declared war on Germany. Joseph was drafted. He could have abstained. Military law allowed for the fact that he only had one daughter. He had no namesake, so military law at the time allowed him that he could have abstained, but he didn't. He felt like it was his duty to go and protect our country and to fight for freedom. He ended up in the 126th Infantry out of Michigan, and on March 6, 1918, they showed up on the coast of France. Their orders was that they were just going to be a replacement unit. In other words, they thought that all they were really going to be doing was they're going to be down at the docks unloading supplies. And that's kind of what they did for a couple of months. They were just a replacement unit. But eventually, they were upgraded and they became a combat unit. They were on the field. This past Friday, 106 years ago, the 126th found themselves in an area of France that was occupied by Germany. And it was the first time that they had been in combat. Joseph Guyton was positioned somewhere near the front of the line, and his orders were to fire his gun intermittently, meaning kind of randomly fire his gun. About midnight on May 24th, he fired his gun, and then a barrage of fire came back from the German forces. One of those bullets found Joseph and killed him instantly. In that moment on May 24th, 1918, Joseph became the first American soldier in World War I that was killed on German-occupied land. Corporal Emil Ganser was a member of the 126th. A few years after the war, he wrote an account of their regiment. And in that account, he wrote something very specific about the men of the 126 that he served with that died in service to us, including men like Joseph Guyton. This is what Emil wrote. Those of our number who are not privileged to return become our most precious contribution to the onward march of democracy. They become, too, a heritage for those yet unborn, an inspiration for them to serve as they served, to make this world what God would have it be. Moral excellence, knowledge, self-control, perseverance, godliness, brotherly kindness, love. Why should we listen to those reminders from Peter? Why should we pursue those qualities in our lives? Because Jesus Christ has given us our most precious contribution toward the onward march, not of democracy, but of freedom. True, lasting, everlasting freedom. And Jesus and his sacrifice is an everlasting heritage and hope for those yet unborn. The hope of the gospel is for those yet unborn. How precious it is to me that my grandmother was praying for a pastor to be in the family. But in that prayer, she was just assuming that God was going to save people in her family. The salvation that comes to those yet unborn, all of that is found in the sacrifice of Jesus. The hope and the heritage of that is there. And Jesus is the ultimate inspiration to serve as he served for what God will make this world to be. The Lord reigns, and no one takes his scepter away. Let us remember that. Let us be ready to remember